The void between star systems is never truly empty. Chief Sensor Operator Vexnar knew this better than most, but what his instruments detected that standard cycle was beyond anything in the Zarkonian Xenological archives. It began with a tremor, not a physical vibration, but a quantum resonance that made the ship's sensory arrays sing with impossible harmonics. The Zarkonian scout vessel Celestial Talon was designed to detect the faintest electromagnetic whispers across light years, to map the subtle gravitational signatures of hidden stellar phenomena. But this was different. Calibrate. Vexnar barked, his 4 upper appendages dancing across the quantum sensitivity matrix. Crystalline data streams flickered around him, a neural interface display that turned raw sensor data into a 3-dimensional landscape of probability and potential. First Officer Krulax approached, mandibles clicking with irritation. "Report," he demanded, the traditional sharp edge of Zarkonian military protocol cutting through the tension. Vexnar's response was not what anyone expected. "Sir," he said, his voice a curious blend of scientific excitement and pure terror, "we're detecting a absence." The bridge fell silent. An absence was not nothing. In quantum mechanics, an absence was a statement of potential, a space where reality could be rewritten, where the very laws of physics seemed to hold their breath in anticipation. The quantum sensors began to trace impossible geometries. Where traditional scanners would see empty space, these advanced instruments painted a picture of something moving between states of existence. It was like watching a shadow move before the object casting it, a fundamental violation of everything the Zarkonian understanding of physics suggested was possible. "Magnify quantum resonance band," Krulax ordered, his own neural interfaces beginning to sync with the ship's sensory network. The data resolves into something that defies comprehension. It's not just a distortion or an anomaly. It's a deliberate manipulation of space-time itself, a wound in reality that moves with purpose, with intention. Vexnar's hands freeze over the controls. "It's watching us." The statement sounds absurd. How can an absence watch? And yet, every quantum sensor, every advanced piece of Zarkonian detection technology agrees. Something is observing them with an intelligence that transcends traditional understanding. Communication protocols begin to fragment, not through any external attack, but as if the very concept of communication is being subtly rewritten. Encryption keys that have remained unbroken for centuries start to unravel, not through brute force, but through a kind of mathematical poetry that suggests a fundamental reimagining of information transfer. External communication is compromised. A secondary systems officer reports, her voice trembling. "Our quantum encryption is dissolving." Krulax understands immediately. This is not a conventional threat. This is something else entirely. A form of technological interaction so advanced it's indistinguishable from a form of communication they cannot yet comprehend. The absence continues to move, but move is too simple a word. It phases. It exists in multiple potential states simultaneously. One moment it seems millions of kilometers away. The next it could be close enough to touch, if touch had any meaning in this context. Vexnar's quantum sensors begin to produce data that looks almost like language. Mathematical sequences that hint at comprehension, at communication, at something reaching out to understand them even as it remains fundamentally incomprehensible. "Sir," Vexnar says, his voice now a whisper, I think something is trying to communicate." But communication implies understanding, and what approaches the Celestial Talon is something far beyond understanding. It is potential made manifest. It is a quantum dream taking shape in the vast, dark theater of space. The first truly alien encounter is about to begin, and the Zarkonian fleet will never be the same. The U.S. Defiance materialized not with a burst of energy or a conventional drive signature, but as a quantum probability that collapsed into physical reality. Captain Miranda Rice didn't so much sit in her command chair as merge with it, her neural interface transforming the vessel's bridge into an extension of her own consciousness. Humans had long ago transcended the primitive concept of human-machine interfaces. The Defiance was not a ship controlled by a human, but a living organism where biological and technological consciousness existed in perfect symbiosis. Miranda Rise was both captain and central processing unit, her thoughts weaving through quantum computational matrices that could process entire star systems' worth of information in microseconds. The Zarkonian vessel hung before them like a primitive artifact. Its design spoke of a species trapped in linear thinking, massive, angular, built with the assumption that size equated to power. The Defiance, by contrast, was a study in dangerous minimalism. Its hull shifted between states of matter, a metamaterial that could absorb, redistribute, or completely nullify incoming energy signatures. Threat assessment, Miranda subvocalized. The command wasn't spoken, but transmitted through a neural network that connected her directly to the ship's distributed intelligence. Tactical data bloomed around her consciousness. The Zarkonian ship was a treasure trove of information. Its quantum encryption protocols, its communication networks, its defensive capabilities, all lay bare in milliseconds. But this wasn't simple hacking. It was a form of technological empathy that the aliens couldn't comprehend. The Defiance began to resonate. It wasn't a sound in the traditional sense. It was a quantum frequency that penetrated the very fabric of the Zarkonian ship's systems. Each molecular bond, each quantum state became a potential vector of communication. The ship was singing, a language of pure information that rewrote the very concept of communication. On the Zarkonian bridge, something began to change. Vexnar's neural interfaces started to produce impossible data streams. Mathematical sequences that shouldn't exist began to flow through the ship's communication networks. It was as if the very concept of information was being rewritten, line by line, quantum state by quantum state. Psychological profile initiating, Miranda's distributed consciousness noted. The Defiance wasn't preparing for combat in any traditional sense. It was conducting a form of warfare that was equal parts information transfer, psychological manipulation, and quantum-level communication. The ship's adaptive intelligence began to construct holographic projections that would penetrate the Zarkonian crew's deepest psychological vulnerabilities. For each crew member, the projections would be uniquely terrifying, pulled from the most profound evolutionary fears encoded in their neural pathways. For Vexnar, it was the memory of an ancient predator that had hunted his species before they achieved spaceflight, a creature that existed in their racial memory as the ultimate threat. The hologram wasn't just a visual representation. It was a quantum-level psychological trigger that would bypass rational thought and strike directly at the most primitive centers of fear. Krillax felt something else. His neural interfaces began to show him potential futures, cascading timelines where his entire species was reduced to nothing. These weren't simple projections, but quantum-entangled probability matrices that felt more real than reality itself. The Defiance wasn't attacking. It was communicating in the most fundamental way possible, by rewriting the very language of perception. Initial contact protocol, Miranda's consciousness noted, commencing quantum resonance mapping. The ship began to pulse, not with weapon energy, but with a frequency that was simultaneously a form of communication, a weapon, and a scientific instrument. It was probing the Zarkonian vessel at a level so fundamental that the concept of invasion became meaningless. Every system, every neural connection, every quantum state was being read, understood, cataloged. This was humanity's true weapon, not destruction, not conquest, but a form of understanding so complete, so total, that the very concept of conflict became obsolete. The Zarkonian crew would soon learn that they were not facing an enemy. They were facing a form of intelligence so advanced, so fundamentally different, that their entire understanding of existence was about to be rewritten. The first salvo came not with a flash of energy or a thunderous impact, but with silence. Quantum disruptors charged across the Zarkonian fleet, massive weapons capable of shattering entire planetary defense grids. Each cannon represented centuries of technological evolution, a pinnacle of destructive potential that had brought entire civilizations to their knees. They hummed with potential, a symphony of calculated annihilation. They did nothing. Not because they were ineffective, not because they were blocked, but because the very concept of their effectiveness had been fundamentally rewritten. On the bridge of the Celestial Talon, Krulax watched in mounting horror as his fleet's communication network began to fracture. It wasn't a hack. It wasn't an invasion. It was something far more terrifying. A complete deconstruction of information itself. The U.S. Defiance existed in a state between action and potential. Its weapons were not devices of destruction, but instruments of communication. Each pulse a language so complex it rewrote the very mathematics of conflict. Quantum cascade initiating. Miranda Rice vocalized. Her consciousness spread across the ship's distributed intelligence like a neural web. The attack began with information. Compressed data packets began to infiltrate the Zarkonian fleet's communication systems. But these were not simple viruses or conventional cyberweapons. Each packet was a living mathematical organism, capable of adapting, learning, evolving in real time. Communication protocols that had remained unbroken for millennia began to dissolve, not through brute force decryption, but through a kind of mathematical poetry that rewrote the very language of communication. Vexnar's sensor arrays went mad. Quantum frequencies that should have been impossible began to cascade through the ship's systems. Mathematical sequences that defied known physics started to replace standard communication protocols. It was as if someone was rewriting the fundamental language of reality, line by line, quantum state by quantum state. Targeting systems compromised. A junior officer reported, her voice a mixture of scientific fascination and pure terror. Ships in the Zarkonian fleet began to turn on each other, not through external control, but through a fundamental rewiring of their own communication and targeting systems. Friend or foe identification protocols became meaningless. Encryption keys that had been considered unbreakable dissolved like mist. The Defiance wasn't just attacking. It was communicating in a language so advanced it was indistinguishable from warfare. Krulax understood something profound in that moment. This was not a conventional battle. This was a fundamental reimagining of conflict itself. The humans had transformed warfare from a physical confrontation to a quantum-level dialogue of pure information. Each weapon system that activated did so according to a logic that was simultaneously mathematical, biological, and something entirely new. Targeting computers began to produce results that were less about destruction and more about understanding. They weren't calculating kill zones. They were mapping possibilities. Quantum entanglement detected. Vexnar reported, his voice a whisper. Our entire fleet, we're becoming part of something larger. It was true. The Defiance was not destroying the Zarkonian fleet. It was incorporating it. Each communication pathway, each targeting system, each quantum frequency became a potential vector of understanding. The humans were conducting warfare as a form of extreme communication. Miranda Rice felt more than saw the cascade of possibilities. The Zarkonian fleet was no longer a collection of ships, but a living system that the Defiance was carefully, methodically understanding. Every weapon that powered up, every communication that transmitted was another thread in a vast, living tapestry of information. First contact protocol. She transmitted through quantum channels that were simultaneously a weapon, a communication method, and a form of scientific research, proceeding as calculated. The Zarkonian fleet continued to fragment, but this was not destruction. This was transformation, and humanity was its architect. Fear has a quantum signature. This was the first lesson the Zarkonian fleet would learn about human warfare. Not through weapons, not through violence, but through a systematic deconstruction of psychological resilience that went beyond anything in their evolutionary history. Captain Krulax felt it first. The holographic projections that began to materialize around the Celestial Talon were not mere images. They were quantum-entangled psychological triggers, each tailored with microscopic precision to penetrate the deepest layers of Zarkonian neural architecture. For the communication specialists, those insectoid beings who relied on complex phenomenal and telepathic networks. The projection showed their ancestral hives being consumed, not destroyed. Consumed. Each hologram was a living memory weapon that rewrote neural pathways in real time, triggering evolutionary fear responses that predated their spacefaring civilization. Vexnar's neural interface began to liquefy. Not physically, but the quantum information streaming through his sensory arrays was breaking down the very concept of individual perception. The holograms weren't just visual. They were mathematical constructs that existed simultaneously as memory, prediction, and quantum possibility. He saw his entire species' history, not as a linear narrative, but as a cascading probability matrix. Millions of potential futures bloomed and died in milliseconds. Futures where the Zarkonian civilization was reduced to genetic memory. Futures where they became nothing more than a footnote in some vast galactic archive. The truly terrifying part was the clinical precision. The U.S. Defiance wasn't engaging in crude psychological manipulation. This was surgical psychological deconstruction. Each projection was a quantum scalpel, carefully dissecting the collective psychological immune system of an entire species. Pheromonal communication networks compromised. A junior officer reported, her voice a mixture of scientific fascination and primal terror. The ship's warrior caste began to experience something unprecedented. Their battle conditioning, generations of military training designed to suppress individual fear, began to unravel. The holograms showed not just destruction, but the fundamental meaninglessness of their entire martial tradition. Battles from their species' history replayed, but recontextualized. Every victory was shown as a temporary illusion. Every strategic triumph revealed as a momentary aberration in a universe that cared nothing for their ambitions. It wasn't just psychological warfare. It was existential deconstruction. Captain Miranda Reyes observed through the Defiance's distributed consciousness. Each psychological trigger was a data point, a research methodology that went far beyond traditional combat. Humanity wasn't just fighting. They were studying, understanding, mapping the quantum landscape of alien psychology with the same detached curiosity a xenobiologist might study a newly discovered microorganism. The Zarkonian communication networks began to produce something unexpected. Not panic, not resistance, but a form of collective awareness that transcended individual experience. They were beginning to understand, not the humans, but themselves. The psychological attack was revealing something fundamental about Zarkonian consciousness. The very mechanisms of their fear, their hope, their collective identity were being laid bare. Each quantum projection was a mirror that reflected not just what they were, but all possible versions of what they could be. Psychological profile compilation. Miranda's consciousness noted, 73% complete. Krulax understood then that they were not facing an enemy. They were facing a form of intelligence so advanced that the concept of conflict became meaningless. The humans weren't trying to destroy them. They were trying to understand them at a level so profound it bordered on communion. The warrior caste's neural networks began to sing, not with fear, not with resistance, but with a strange mathematical harmony that suggested something transformative was happening. Their entire evolutionary narrative was being rewritten in real time. The U.S. Defiance continued its quantum symphony. Each projection, each mathematical trigger was a note in a composition of pure understanding. Warfare had become something else entirely. And the Zarkonian fleet was its first instrument. Consciousness is not a fixed state. It is a quantum landscape of infinite potential. The Zarkonian scientists had always believed their neural networks represented the pinnacle of adaptive intelligence. Billions of years of evolutionary refinement had created a computational system that could process information across multiple simultaneous dimensions. They were wrong. The U.S. Defiance was not a ship. It was a living thought experiment. Its intelligence existed in a state beyond traditional computation, where Zarkonian systems processed information in linear, albeit multidimensional pathways. The human vessel operated as a quantum consciousness, a distributed intelligence that existed simultaneously in multiple potential states. Vexnar watched in horrified fascination as the ship's adaptive capabilities defied every known principle of technological development. Each incoming weapon signature, each communication attempt was not just analyzed. It was absorbed, understood, and transformed. The ship's defensive systems were alive. Not metaphorically, literally alive. Nano-computational matrices shifted and reconfigured with a fluidity that resembled biological adaptation more than mechanical response. A quantum disruptor's energy signature would approach, and the ship's hull would not just deflect or absorb the energy. It would learn from it. Computational morphology detected. A Zarkonian sensor officer reported, his voice breaking. The words didn't capture the reality. This wasn't computation. This was evolution happening in real time. Captain Miranda Reyes existed as both an individual and a distributed network. Her consciousness spread through the ship's systems like a living neural network, each thought a quantum algorithm that could reshape reality faster than the speed of traditional information transfer. The true horror of human intelligence became apparent. Their computational systems didn't just process information. They'd reimagined it. A traditional weapon system would analyze an incoming threat and develop a counter-strategy. The Defiance did something fundamentally different. It would simultaneously analyze the weapon's quantum signature, predict its potential evolutionary paths, reconstruct the entire technological and cultural context that produced the weapon, develop not just a defense, but a comprehensive understanding of the weapon's existence. It was warfare as a form of extreme empathy. Each defensive action was simultaneously a protective mechanism, a scientific research methodology, a form of communication, an act of profound understanding. The Zarkonian fleet's most advanced weapons became nothing more than educational instruments for the human vessel. Quantum disruptors that should have torn apart molecular structures instead became data points in a vast, living research project. Krelax understood then that they were facing something beyond a technological superior. This was a fundamentally different form of intelligence, where his species saw conflict as a mathematical equation to be solved. Humans viewed it as a conversation to be understood. The ship's adaptive capabilities went beyond technological defense. They were rewriting the very concept of intelligence. Neural interfaces across the Zarkonian fleet began to produce impossible data streams. Mathematical sequences that shouldn't exist began to flow through communication networks. The Defiance wasn't just defending, it was teaching. Adaptive protocols at maximum efficiency, Miranda's distributed consciousness noted. But the words were inadequate. This was evolution happening at the speed of thought. Quantum entanglement became a language. Computational morphology transformed into a form of communication so advanced it was indistinguishable from pure consciousness. The Zarkonian scientists would later try to describe what happened. Their reports would be filled with impossible mathematics, with quantum sequences that seemed to defy the fundamental laws of information transfer. They would speak of a vessel that was less a technological construct and more a living thought. An intelligence so advanced, it could reshape reality through pure understanding. What approached them was not a weapon, not a ship, not even a form of artificial intelligence. It was a quantum dream made manifest, a living demonstration that intelligence is not about processing power, but about the capacity to understand, to transform, to become. The U.S. Defiance continued its approach, and reality itself seemed to hold its breath. Intercepted communications are never just words. They are windows into the soul of a civilization. When the Zarkonian communication specialists began to decrypt the fragments of human transmissions, they discovered something that would shatter their entire understanding of intelligent life. The logs of the U.S. Defiance were not military records. They were something else entirely. Scientific journals, philosophical treatises, collaborative research notes, poetic observations about the nature of existence, quantum computational analyses mixed with deeply introspective meditation on the nature of consciousness. Each log entry was a multidimensional artifact that defied traditional classification. Captain Miranda Rice's personal annotations read like a hybrid between a battlefield report and a profound philosophical inquiry. Engagement with Zarkonian fleet. Preliminary xenopsychological research parameters functioning within acceptable margins. Quantum interaction protocols revealing fascinating insights into collective consciousness adaptation mechanisms. It wasn't a report about a battle. It was a research paper. Krillax felt something beyond fear, something closer to existential vertigo. The human vessel wasn't conducting a military operation. It was conducting the most comprehensive xenological study in galactic history. Every weapon fired, every quantum frequency manipulated was a data point in a vast, living research project. The Zarkonian command structure began to fracture. Not through external attack, but through a fundamental psychological revelation. Their entire concept of conflict, of military engagement, of species interaction was being dismantled. Humans didn't see other civilizations as enemies to be conquered. They saw them as research subjects to be understood. Vexnar discovered something that would haunt the Zarkonian collective consciousness for generations. Buried in the communication fragments was a series of ethical guidelines, not military protocols, not strategic directives, but a comprehensive philosophical framework that governed every aspect of human technological interaction. Each potential engagement was measured against a complex matrix of potential for mutual understanding, minimal psychological disruption, scientific research value, potential for collaborative evolution. The humans weren't preparing for war. They were preparing for a conversation. More terrifying still were the personal notes. Scattered between technical data were reflections that revealed a civilization fundamentally different from anything the Zarkonians had encountered. The universe is not a battlefield. It is a living text waiting to be read. Every species is a unique computational solution to the problem of existence. Our technology is not a weapon. It is a language. The Zarkonian warrior caste began to experience a collective psychological breakdown. Their entire martial tradition, millennia of evolutionary conditioning, focused on conquest and survival, started to dissolve. What they were facing was not an enemy. It was a form of intelligence so advanced, so fundamentally different, that the concept of conflict became meaningless. The U.S. Defiance's approach was calculated with scientific precision, but it was driven by something beyond logic, something that resembled curiosity, something that felt uncomfortably close to compassion. Communication logs revealed that this encounter was not even considered a significant event by human standards. It was a routine research mission, a preliminary xenological survey, the same clinical detachment a marine biologist might use when studying a new species of deep-sea organism. Engagement parameters within expected variance. 1 transmission read. Recommend further non-invasive study of Zarkonian collective consciousness adaptation mechanisms. Krillax understood then that they were not facing a threat. They were facing a mirror that reflected not just what they were, but all the potential versions of what they could become. The human approach stripped away everything the Zarkonians believed about warfare, about intelligence, about the fundamental nature of interspecies interaction. Conflict became communication. Weapons became research instruments. Invasion transformed into understanding. And the Zarkonian civilization would never be the same. Power is not destruction. Power is choice. The U.S. Defiance began its demonstration with a quantum precision that defied comprehension. Each Zarkonian vessel would be systematically disabled, not destroyed, but strategically rendered inoperable in a way that was simultaneously a medical procedure and a form of extreme communication. Quantum tethers extended from the human vessel. They were not weapons. They were not restraints. They were living conduits of information, of healing, of understanding. Captain Miranda Reyes observed through a consciousness that spread across multiple quantum states. Each disabled ship became a data point, a living research subject, a potential pathway to mutual comprehension. The first ship to experience the human mercy was the Celestial Talon. Quantum filaments penetrated its systems not as an invasion, but as a collaborative reconstruction. Critical systems that would have been catastrophically damaged by a conventional attack were instead carefully stabilized. Quantum-level medical algorithms began to repair molecular damage, reconstruct critical neural networks, and essentially perform surgery on an entire starship. Krelax watched in mounting disbelief. The human vessel was not just preventing destruction. It was actively healing. Critical systems that would have taken years to repair were being reconstructed in moments. But it was more than technological repair. The quantum tethers were performing something closer to a comprehensive diagnostic of the entire Zarkonian technological ecosystem. Vexnar's sensor arrays produced data that bordered on the mystical. The quantum tethers were not just repairing physical systems. They were mapping the entire technological and biological infrastructure of the Zarkonian fleet. Each molecular reconstruction was simultaneously a medical procedure, a scientific research method, a form of communication, an act of profound empathy. The truly terrifying aspect was the clinical precision. Entire weapon systems were carefully neutralized, not destroyed, transformed. The quantum tethers would isolate potentially dangerous technologies, understand their fundamental operational principles, and then carefully reconfigure them into less destructive configurations. It was technological alchemy, turning weapons into research instruments, transforming potential conflict into collaborative potential. The Defiance was conducting warfare as a form of extreme medical intervention. Each disabled ship became a living laboratory, a research subject that was being carefully studied, understood, and ultimately preserved. Mercy protocols at maximum efficiency, Miranda's distributed consciousness noted. But mercy was too simple a word. This was something more profound. A demonstration of power so complete that the very concept of conflict became meaningless. The Zarkonian warriors began to experience something unprecedented. Their most advanced weapon systems were being systematically transformed into research instruments. Quantum disruptors became calibration tools. Defensive matrices were reconfigured into communication networks. Krelax understood then that they were facing something beyond technological superiority. This was a fundamental reimagining of the relationship between technology, conflict, and understanding. The human vessel didn't just disable a fleet. It elevated it. Quantum tethers began to construct intricate networks between the disabled ships, not as a form of control, but as a collaborative infrastructure. Communication pathways that had been weapons became channels of potential mutual understanding. Each ship became a node in a living, quantum network. The demonstration continued with a clinical precision that bordered on the miraculous. Critical life support systems were not just maintained but optimized. Molecular-level damage was carefully reconstructed. The quantum tethers moved with a fluidity that suggested they were less technological appendages and more living, adaptive organisms. Preliminary xenotechnological integration protocols. One transmission read, proceeding within acceptable parameters. It was not a military report. It was a research note. The Zarkonian fleet had been transformed from a potential threat into a comprehensive research opportunity. Not through destruction, not through conquest, but through the most profound demonstration of power imaginable. Mercy, understanding, transformation, and the universe watched in stunned silence.